Now, one of the many issues for the in-tray of Nicola Sturgeon's successor is a bill to create buffer zones around abortion clinics. It's been spearheaded by the Green MSP Gillian Mackay and was fully backed last year by the First Minister. But pro-choice campaigners feel progress has been slow, especially when other parts of the UK could see them introduced by summer. In this special report, STV's Westminster editor Catherine Sampson has been to visit one clinic in West London that's had a buffer zone in place for nearly 5 years.
It was a UK first.
Tonight we have our safe zone and we've made history.
In 2018, Ealing Council banned anti-abortion campaigners from approaching women right outside a local clinic. It meant they could be fined for singing, protesting, praying or leafleting within a 100-metre radius of here. A victory for pro-choice campaigners.
What difference has the buffer zone made here in Ealing?
The buffer zone has completely eradicated any sort of intimidation and harassment for any clinic users going in. And the intimidation and harassment have been taking place here for 23 years, so quite a big difference. And there is actually a dedicated area where they are allowed to stand. There are rules within that, so they're not allowed to display graphic images, for example. In order for it to be upheld in court, they felt like it was an appropriate measure, but no subsequent buffer zone has had a designated area included.
Claire McCulloch is a founder of the Good Counsel Network, a religious group which still has a daily presence here.
We're seeing a lot less women who will stop and ask us for help. They won't even find us because we're so far from the abortion centre. So we feel that a lot of women who could have accessed a lot of help at the last minute, usually the most vulnerable kinds of women, are missing out on the opportunity to do that.
Before the buffer zone came in, were you or people who came to the vigils harassing women?
No, we weren't harassing women. You know, we have a prayer vigil and an outreach offering help.
If this is about advice and about prayer, surely it doesn't matter whether that is happening 150 metres down the road, does it?
Well, you say that. I mean, there's lots of occasions in life where we pray at the site of a tragedy.
Ealing's abortion clinic has been managed by Sally O'Brien for the last 7 years.
I've heard of people that have not come to their appointment on the day because they've been so harassed and upset. They would talk at them about how their decision was wrong, that they were murderers. They would press plastic fetuses into their hand and tell them that they would burn in hell if they continued. We have had a couple of times where people have breached the PSPO and placed themselves outside the clinic, singing, praying, and the police have had to intervene. But it's much, much better than it was. Every person should be able to attend a medical clinic unimpeded. It shouldn't be a postcode lottery as to whether or not you're going to be harassed.
Do not continue to look to this death clinic for salvation.
Scenes like this still face women accessing abortion and other services at NHS sites across Scotland. At Westminster, MPs have already backed nationwide buffer or safe access zones for England and Wales. There's one step to go before that's law.
Looks like we're tantalisingly close. It will be the culmination of a campaign to allow women bodily autonomy and just to exercise their legal right to have a completely legal medical procedure. The freedom of religion, thought, expression, that has always been outweighed by the right of the woman to have privacy and anonymity.
It's not guarantees, but there's an expectation that nationwide buffer zones could be in place here in England from the summer. This may affect some Scottish women who currently have to travel here because no Scottish Health Board provides abortions right up to the legal limit of 24 weeks. Some have only recently started offering them at 20 weeks. In Northern Ireland, nationwide buffer zones come into force from May after the Supreme Court ruled these did not disproportionately interfere with protesters' freedom of speech. Nicola Sturgeon unequivocally backed a bill on buffer zones. Ministers say it's legally tricky, but there's building frustration.
I think it'd be really disappointing if Scotland was the last country in the UK to implement this, because I think that, you know, there's been a lot of chances for us to get this in place ahead of England, ahead of Northern Ireland. The Scottish Government have dragged their feet a little with this campaign and they've just not seen it as a priority.
All I can say is that we are going to do this as fast as we possibly can. None of us are dragging our heels. We all want it to happen. We want to produce legislation that is robust.
Legal challenges could come from big anti-abortion groups like 40 Days for Life, who now have a presence in Scotland. Every year they ramp up efforts over Lent, which starts tomorrow.
Well, joining us now is Grace Brown from the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children and journalist Abby Garton-Crosbie. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Abby, to you first of all, why do you think buffer zones are needed in Scotland?
I think that it's a very important policy that needs to be brought in. We have seen a rise in the number of people protesting outside of abortion clinics, and I do think it's important that women who are accessing those services do that without intimidation, without fear and without harassment, which whether or not the protesters who are standing outside, even if they're standing outside quietly, that can be intimidating to someone who has not made this decision lightly. As you know, I think Kate Forbes said earlier during her interview that anyone who is seeking an abortion or going to a health clinic has not made this decision lightly. They have obviously considered this, and having that last kind of barrier to them, which could, you know, impact them or stop them from seeking help, is something that I think really needs to be dealt with as soon as possible.
What's your response to that, Grace? I mean, obviously some women do feel harassed and threatened, maybe even frightened. That's why they want buffer zones introduced.
Well, harassment and intimidation simply just does not take place at pro-life vigils. So FOIs from Police Scotland and NHS Lothian have recorded that there are no incidents of harassment, intimidation, there's no arrests, there's no complaints. And, you know, as well, a 2018 Home Office study also concluded that pro-life vigils were peaceful and passive in nature. So there is no evidence pointing towards the fact that harassment or intimidation takes place.
What about the campaigners that are standing there with very graphic images and holding these plastic fetuses? These women could be in a very delicate state of mind. I mean, that's not fair to put them through that, is it?
Well, of course, I think that abortion can be an agonising experience for many women, and SPUC does recognise that, and that's why it is so important that pro-life vigils are there to offer support, help and assistance. And, you know, to ban a pro-life vigil is ultimately to block a woman from receiving access to support and information. So that's why it is really important that pro-life vigils are there.
Abby?
I would disagree with that, because obviously the people who can give advice to women who are seeking an abortion should be medical professionals, and also the buffer zones, as much as, you know, people do have a right to protest. I personally believe that that should be outside of the Scottish Parliament, where the legislation is being considered. And if people who are against this want to take that to the politicians, I think that that's the appropriate place to take it, not outside of a health clinic.
But Grace is saying that it's peaceful protests.
I can understand why she would say it's peaceful, because they're standing there silently. But if you're still walking past and seeing those signs, I would be intimidated by seeing that. And I'm not easily intimidated. And I use the Sandyford Clinic for other things. It's not just women who use them for abortion. It's a lot of other reproductive things. So, you know, there could be somebody who's walking past that's had an abortion in the past and be triggered by that. You know, it's going to have an impact. I think saying that even though they're silent means, and that the police there haven't been any recorded incidents by the police, doesn't mean that it hasn't happened.
Well, that's an interesting point. It can be very upsetting to women, and also the women that go in there will have been extensively counselled, I would imagine, by medical professionals. I mean, what do these campaigners feel they can add?
Well, you know, I think that we need to listen to the voices of women and hear what they say. And the reality is that for a lot of women who have had abortions, they weren't offered that support and that information from the healthcare professionals in which they expected to receive. So for a pro-life vigil can really be a last lifeline of support for many women who aren't getting that support elsewhere. And I think as well, this is about what a pro-life vigil is. A pro-life vigil is not a protest. A pro-life vigil is a peaceful gathering which is community-based.
Well, has anyone's mind ever been changed by one of the campaigners?
Of course, yes. You know, there's women across the UK who've encountered a pro-life vigil before going into an abortion clinic. They received alternative information, alternative choices, and they kept their child.
Well, I mean, Abby, what's your response to that? And also, do you think this legislation will be introduced, and when?
Just to go on your second question first, the last time I spoke to Gillian Mackay about this at the previous Buffer Zone Summit, she had said that she hopes that this legislation is brought in before the next Lent in the next 40 days. So we're hoping that it's going to be in the space of a year, essentially. But obviously with Nicola Sturgeon and the whole leadership campaign going on at the moment, there is probably a bit of concern about whether or not that timetable will be stuck to. But obviously Marie Todd will probably continue to do that. But yeah, on what you were saying about, women should be listened to. I agree, women should be listened to, and women should have the choice to go into these clinics without fear of harassment and being intimidated. If they do want to seek support, there's a lot of ways to seek the support through the NHS. I understand that there probably are some concerns if healthcare providers aren't giving the information that they need, but that's a discussion that needs to be had. I don't think it should fall to religious groups to...
OK, and let's just quickly ask Grace, if the legislation is introduced, would groups like yours challenge it?
I think we would need to assess that when the situation comes. Of course, we wouldn't want to see any legislation which affects women's ability to access information around their pregnancy, and we also wouldn't want to see legislation come into place which is anti-democratic, intolerant and restricts women in any way. So we would evaluate that when the time comes.
OK, and we will have to leave it there. But Abby and Grace, thank you both very much indeed for joining us this evening. Thank you.